now, like we're live.
Okay.
So Harold Underdown.
Hey, Mel. Thanks
Here
for
we,
inviting me on.
yeah, here we are together. And I told you that I'm incredibly honored and excited to be interviewing you. I think that you are a truly remarkable individual,
Thank you.
and we'll talk about that. But first, we need the jingle.
The jingle.
Yeah, yeah, I spent like years and thousands of dollars making this jingle. So
Oh,
we
okay.
have to hear. We have to hear it. We are going to hear it.
Get a chair, grab a seat, or we'll sweep you off your feet. We move, we groove, you got Mel. Ease your legs, rest a while, all you gotta do is smile. We're swell, can't you tell, you got Mel. When the show begins, you better hold on real tight, or before you know it, you'll be high as a kite. Take a break, settle down, we're the only show in town. SRO, don't you know, you got Mel. Give it up, don't think twice, we're a hurricane on ice. What the hell, give a yell, ring your bell, show and tell. Mademoiselle, give a smell, you got Mel. You've got Mel.
And
Wow.
Mel has the
That,
incredible hat.
that was, that's really classy. I like that.
Yeah, Paul Simon helped me, but he didn't want any credits.
I could tell it was sort of in the background there. Yeah.
Yeah. So Harold Underdown. That's an interesting name for a Jewish guy.
Well, I came by my Jewish heritage in the usual way. I married into it. And the name Underdown it's actually one of those geographic names like Underwood or Underhill, except that there aren't as many downs as there are woods or hills, so there aren't as many Underdowns.
So and okay, so now's the time to tell us all about yourself. And one second, when was the last time you were interviewed like this?
Well, I've never been interviewed specifically on Facebook Live, but I did do a video interview a couple of months ago.
Okay, and what was that about?
That was very specifically about publishing trends.
Ah, okay. We won't talk about publishing trends.
Kind of boring stuff.
I don't know what they are even. So tell us about you, Harold.
That's a very general question. Can you narrow that down a bit?
Yeah, about your life, how you ended up being a world-renowned children's book editor, stuff like that.
Okay. Well, where should I start? Should I start after college?
No, start as a kid.
Oh, okay. So
you're an editor of children's books.
Right. Well, I was a child once. That's very true. I was a faculty brat. My dad taught at a few different universities, and we moved around. And I think a combination of being in an academic family where books were a complete feature of pretty much every room in the house. My mom, by the way, was a PhD as well, though she did not pursue a career in the way my father did.
But you're allowed to say that your dad was a professor of what?
He was a professor of English history, specifically focusing on the period around the English Civil War. And he was also English himself, and we had family in England, and he had research interests in England. So one of the features of my childhood was going back and forth to England every year or two. But I think a combination of the moving around and the being in a book-loving family meant that I was a reader at a pretty early age, and books were important to me. And in fact, I still remember and talk about the two picture books that I really cared about as a small child, which of course were Harold and the Purple Crayon and Ezra Jack Keats' The Snowy Day, which to this day I believe are paragons of the picture book art. And I will happily talk about The Snowy Day in particular in detail to demonstrate that, but I won't do that now.
Okay.
So we moved around.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Your mom PhD in what?
PhD in English literature. She studied Sir Philip Sidney, and she wrote her thesis on the Arcadia, which is an interesting, very long narrative, a prose narrative. In some ways, it's a forerunner to the first English novels. It's also just full of weird courtly stuff, but there you go.
So were you really a brat, or you were just being facetious?
Well, faculty brat is the term, that you use for someone whose family moved around because of the
Well,
university.
I can't see you as a brat. What
No,
kind of?
I wasn't a brat. I was probably too well behaved for my own good, actually. But it's like military brat. You move around, you go to different bases because your parents in the military. Same thing. Yeah, it's not a judgment on the individual.
Okay, so you were you a bookworm? Did you?
Yeah, I would say I was, and I read a lot of stuff. I mean, once I got away from picture books, I remember I read all of the Encyclopedia Brown books that I could get my hands on. I think I got those through a school book club. I don't know if it was Scholastic back then, but it was that same cheap paperback with the really bad quality paper. But I didn't care because I would read the book a few times until it basically fell apart, and then you were done with it. So Encyclopedia Brown, and I was very much into Tom Swift, which was one of those series like the Bobbsey Twins and Nancy Drew, except it was a kind of generic science fiction thing. And Tom Swift was probably a somewhat in Randian character. He was this American genius, inventor, and businessman. And every one of the stories was about Tom Smith inventing something. So, you'd have Tom Smith and his atomic toothbrush. There were a lot of atomic somethings. They thought atomic was good back then. And I would sort of read through those and then move on. But I also did read good stuff. Like I remember one of the wonderful books that I got exposed to early, mainly as a result of our travels to England, was a book called The Children of Green Know by L.M. Boston, which is this amazing magical story of a small boy visiting his great-grandmother at an ancient manor house in the Norfolk Broads, and the adventures that he has there, coupled with the family stories that she tells him. It's a very unusual book. And I just, I love to get lost in stories like that.
So when I was reading Sherlock Holmes, you were reading good stuff.
Oh, I was reading Sherlock Holmes too. Thank you for reminding me of Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, I got into Sherlock Holmes as well. Sherlock Holmes is good stuff. I think at some point I was given the collected Sherlock Holmes, which was this really thick book that had every story, even the ones that weren't very good. And I think that must have been like a present when I was 11 or 12, something like that. Yeah.
So Harold, so in your honor today, I'm wearing my purple shirt. Because
that's purple.
Yes,
it looks
because
blue on my screen.
I know, but it's in honor of Harold and the purple crayon. And
right.
Is that why they named you Harold? Is that why they named the book Harold? What's
no.
Story?
There's actually no connection. I mean, my name Harold. There are different stories about that in the family. Now, the main reason is probably that my grandfather on one side was Harold, though he was Danish, so it was Harald. But that was my mother's father.
What?
He was Danish, so his name was spelled Harald. That's
Danish. That's another children's book connection.
Well, Hans Christian Andersen, sure.
You got
Anyway,
it from all sides, man.
The other story though is that I was named Harold after a cricket player that my father venerated, Harold Gimblett, or possibly after Harold Wilson, the Labor politician. But I think those are stories that were made up after the fact.
Somebody in your family venerated Wilson?
Sure. My father was a Labor Party supporter his entire life.
Okay. I can go with that. Given the Tory record in Britain. But we're not going to go into politics.
No, not go into politics.
So
yeah. So I, that love of reading stayed with me really through school. I branched out. I got into Ursula Le Guin. I discovered the Earthsea books when I was, I believe, in high school. And I started exploring kind of what I would call the more interesting and challenging science fiction and fantasy. That was a big personal interest of mine. And of course, when I went to college, I was an English major. And when I was done with
You
college,
could have studied atomic physics.
no, I kind of turned away from Tom Swift. Although I did like science, I actually enjoyed science at the high school level, but when I got to college, most of the science courses were occupied by people who were in a pre-med program, and they were very competitive, and I just didn't want to even get into that.
And who wants to hang out with occupiers?
Well, I didn't want to be competing with pre-med students.
Okay. So you went into literature.
So I went into literature, and I did not do the typical thing that an editor does, which is you graduate from college with your English major degree, and you get a job as an editorial assistant at a big publisher in New York, and you just go on from there. I didn't do that. I didn't have any idea at that point that I wanted to go into publishing. I thought I wanted to go into teaching. And after a couple of years of doing other stuff, including getting an actual degree in teaching, I made an attempt at teaching. I moved to New York, and
One second, you moved to New York from where?
Well, that's a little complicated, and I'm just going to skip over all the details of that. But basically, indirectly from college to New York, with a few years in between doing various things. Okay, because it's boring.
That means that you were a spy.
The key thing was I ended up in New York, right, which is where you want to be, right? So I found that teaching was not something that came naturally to me, at least not with third and fourth graders, which is where I ended up. I loved working with kids on reading. I loved putting a classroom library together. I was a great reader out loud. I did a particularly good performance reading out loud from James and the Giant Peach, and I gave it all the British accents, so that was fun. But you know, you can only spend so much class time reading out loud, unfortunately. So I was not a great teacher, and fortunately, I had through a family connection, I had a connection to somebody who had a connection to somebody who was looking for an editorial assistant at a big publishing company. And that's how I got started after this sort of detour into teaching. But the detour into teaching was actually, in some ways, a very good experience for me, because I saw books being used in the classroom. I saw kids, you know, improving their reading skills. They weren't third and fourth grade, they already knew how to read, but they were still getting better at it. And I saw how that worked. And from some of my coursework, before I started teaching, I learned about this interesting theory called reader response theory, which is a different way of understanding reading than the usual literary criticism one, where we talk about plot and character and we analyze things. In reader response, which is a theory that comes out of educational psychology primarily, you look at how the reader interacts with the text and the way that the text sparks responses, feelings, memories, associations. And that really helped me understand the fact that the reality that when you're writing a story, you can't completely control how the reader is going to react to it. And in fact, you want the reader to kind of make the story their own and imagine stuff beyond the mere words on the page, because it just makes it a much richer experience. And that happens. It happens all the time. It happens naturally. And the writers who have the knack of, in many cases, it's just an intuitive process. The writers who have the knack of taking into account reader response at the particular reader level they're working with, because it's going to be different. You know, kids at 4 years old are going to have very different responses to what they're reading than kids at 14. But if you have a knack for that age group that you're writing for, then you're going to be great with your writing and with your stories. And that was something that it took me a while to kind of really go back to that theory. But I've come to incorporate it very much into my practice as an editor. And it's something that I talk about on a regular basis when I'm doing workshops or, working even individually with folks on their writing, that the importance of remembering that the reader is not a passive pair of eyeballs just taking in what you're giving them. They're interacting with your text.
Okay, which maybe is one reason that people have different reads on different texts.
Exactly. Every reader is different, and inevitably that means that every reader is going to have a different response to a particular story. Now, there are going to be some common ground, but they're also going to be their own idiosyncratic differences. And I'll give you an example. I like to read passages from books to writers that I'm doing a presentation about this on, and ask them to just not think about the plot or the voice or any of that fancy stuff, but just what it's evoking in them. And when I read to them from the opening pages of that book, The Children of Green Know, that I mentioned, it's this boy traveling to see his grandmother, and he's on a train that is traveling across the flooded Norfolk Broads. And they're just, it's just kind of gentle floodwaters. It's something that happens every year, nothing particularly dramatic about it. It's treated in the story clearly as this very routine thing. The train just goes through this standing water. And I read this once to a group in Iowa just after they had had big floods. And one of the people in the audience, and I asked for responses, and one of the people in the audience said, well, I was just terrified for that little boy. He's heading into those floods. How, what's going to happen to him? And I thought, that's really interesting. Here's something that she's bringing to this story that really is affecting the way she's reacting to it. Now, fortunately for her, if she'd read on into the story, she would have seen that the little boy was met at the train station by someone and was taken care of. But, that was not a response that the author of that book would have expected. And yet it was a completely legitimate response because it was based on that person's personal experiences.
We can go back to the book that you love, the snowy one.
Absolutely.
Where you get all sentimental when you read it, but when I read it, because I grew up in Ottawa, where it snows about 9 months a year, I just say, so what? It's snowing. Show me some grass, Harold. I want to see grass. That's exciting.
Right. I mean, the snowy day is another good example. The very beginning of the story, Peter wakes up and looks out the window and it's snowing. And he gets dressed and goes outside. And there's nothing in there telling you what his reaction is. It's all about what he does. Mm-hmm. But for a small child who grew up in a part of the United States, admittedly that's where it's set, right? A part of the United States where snow is an exciting moment. It's an occasion. That part of the story, that child is going to be feeling what Peter was feeling. That child's going to be excited, and they'll go into the story in the same frame of mind that Peter, the main character, is, and then will be reacting to the story along with him. So yeah, that's another example in a picture book of how our experiences can affect how we respond to a story.
So Harold, I've been your student. You're also your private student.
A good student, too.
Well, thank you. This program is about you, though. And you're a remarkable mentor, and I can say a few words about your from my eyeballs as someone who is so gifted at separating the hay, which in my case there's a lot of, from the chaff. It's remarkable the work that you can do, and to be helpfully critical while not being ever hurtful, and that singles you out as a remarkable mensch.
Well, that's what I try to do.
Yeah, but here's the question I've been dying to ask you for 6 months since we started. I don't know, is it 6 months?
Something like that.
Yeah. Why don't you write?
You know what? I don't enjoy writing. I love working with people on their writing, and I'm perfectly happy to write practical stuff, you know, everything from editorial letters to articles that I'm going to put up on my website or something like that. But I don't have the impulse to write creatively. It's never been something that particularly grabbed me. And I often find when I'm writing anything more substantial, like when I went through writing my Idiot's Guide, that it is not an enjoyable process for me. It's not something I feel driven to do. And given that, I'm not interested in doing it. I get a lot more satisfaction from working with different writers on many different stories than if I were to kind of struggle with the process of creating a story myself. You know, I've actually had a hand in probably at this point hundreds of books, and I couldn't have written that many anyways, even if I dedicated my life to doing that, right? So I'm perfectly happy not to have been actually writing myself.
And my next question is, did you fall into children's publishing from the get-go, or is this something you chose?
Well, like I said, I thought I was going to be a teacher out of college.
But was your first job a children's editor?
It was, absolutely, yeah. When I decided that teaching was not for me, I knew that I wanted to work in children's books because that's what interested me. I had been working with children's books, and in fact, this was in the late '80s. I had been working with, you know, a classroom of kids in New York City, very diverse classroom of kids, and I had been struggling. One of the things that I discovered as a teacher was it was difficult back then to find books in which my students could see themselves. And so one of the things I wanted to do when I got into publishing was to find more books for them, to create more books for the students that I had been working with. And that's definitely been something that has stayed with me as one of my goals as an editor. But you know, I also had other interests. I like nonfiction, and I've always worked on doing nonfiction. And you know, I pursued different things, but that initial goal, just kind of coming out of teaching and knowing what was needed, at least in my school at that time, has stayed with me.
Okay. What would you like to tell aspiring children book writers? What would be your messages?
Wow. There are a number of things I do tell aspiring children's book authors, and I think the most important one is just to keep writing. I think a lot of people, they'll have an idea for a story and they'll write that, and then they'll want to immediately send that out and get it published. And people with more experience know that it just doesn't work that way, that you need to learn the craft. And one of the ways you learn the craft is not by just writing something down and sending it out immediately, but by going through the revision process, getting feedback from other people, ideally from a critique group or a teacher or a writer friend who you trust. But even without feedback from others, there are revision techniques you can use to kind of work over your manuscript and examine it and take it apart and put it back together again to make sure that you're really getting it to the level that it needs to be at. Because let's face it, children's book publishing is extremely competitive. It always has been. It's gotten even more so.
But let's talk about the numbers then.
Sure.
I figured out that a children's book agent gets between 5 and 10,000 pitches, or what we call queries, a year.
Right.
Between 5 and 10,000.
Right. Right.
How many new authors did they take a year?
Very few, probably fewer than 10. And that sounds really discouraging when you look at it purely in terms of the numbers. But I actually wrote a piece about this, about the odds and whether you should be concerned about the odds, because of those, let's say it's 10,000, of those 10,000 queries and 10,000 manuscripts, it's very likely that, first of all, at least 90% of them just weren't good enough, that people had just sent them out before they were ready. It will be very obvious early on to anybody reading the query letter that it's just not good enough.
Okay, Harold, that brings us down to 1,000 here.
That brings us down to 1,000. Okay, so of the remaining 1,000, another 90%, the agent will just not be interested in. It'll be well written, but it's just, I've seen this before. Or it's something the agent doesn't do. I mean, a lot of people disqualify themselves because they send a picture book manuscript to an agent who specializes in young adult. So that's another several hundred right there, straight back out again. So you end up probably with 100 that the agent actually is seriously considering.
Harold, that's you've just trashed 99%.
Yes, I have. That's right. Yeah, that's right. And that's because those 99%, they didn't do the two key things. They didn't work on their manuscript until it really was ready, or, frankly, they're manuscripts that you may just at some point say, I don't know what to do with this. I'm not gonna bother with it. Writers do that all the time. Picture book writers who I know, just to focus on picture books for right now, they'll come up with 20 possible ideas for a manuscript in the course of a year or even more. And they'll start writing half of them and they'll finish writing 2 of them, right? So, you filter stuff even before you send it out, hopefully. So people who don't filter and revise, and people who don't do research and disqualify themselves because they're sending the wrong material to that particular agent, that's why you get, 99% just get disqualified pretty easily. Even if the agent isn't reading the queries themselves, if they've got an assistant who's been working with them for 6 months, it's still at that filter point, it's not difficult to filter out the 99%. And that leaves the agent with 100 that they're going to seriously consider. And I think that makes the odds a lot better for you. If you look at it.
It makes the odds about 1 in 100.
1 in 100, but it just needs to be that one manuscript that really speaks to that agent. And at that point, it's not even about the odds anymore. It's that you've got the agent's attention, you've got them engaged, they've gotten excited about your manuscript, and bam, they know they want to work with you as a client. And then the odds just go completely out the window. And, that's the best I can do with that when it comes to the odds. If you find that whole idea of that process of going through those filters, if that just seems impossible to deal with, I can completely understand it, but it's what you have to go through, and it's just a process. And at a certain point, you either go through it, or frankly, you become a hobbyist, you know, someone who writes stories.
So of the people, yeah, of the people, okay, so there are people like me who are masochistic,
Yes.
who keep up. Now, there's another thing you didn't talk about, and that is most agents take on people that they've met at a conference, or that somebody has written. You know, another writer has said, "Hey, you should check out Fred. He's really good."
You know, the whole personal connection thing does happen, and you should certainly, if you have the opportunity and if you're ready for it, you should take it. But it's not the only way. And if you only focus on personal connections, you're limiting yourself.
I think actually that the field now has opened because there's very few fairs and exhibitions and conferences.
Well, that certainly makes a difference this year in particular. But even if we go back to what used to be normal, mm-hmm. my advice is still, you know, you've really got to. What I tell writers is the writing process doesn't end with a finished manuscript. It ends with submission, and even that may only be a temporary end, because once you've sent your manuscript out on submission, you may be putting it into a whole process that ends with it being published. So, you know, you go from idea to early draft to revised draft to finished draft, and then to query. It all has to go together. And if you look at it that way, then I think it helps with kind of dealing with the fact that there is this, frankly, Byzantine and daunting process of submission. Just build it into your thinking about writing, that at least once you get to the point where you feel like you've got stuff you're going to want to submit, you may initially feel like you're learning the craft and you're not focusing on submission. But once you get to a certain point, submission is something that is going to happen at the end of the process.
So Harold, what I think is that to an extent you're right. You have to, at every age, including mine, improve your craft, improve your stories, and and send in to agents. But let's say that she's going to pick, and it's usually a she, is going to pick one out of 100.
Right.
But she's interested in a book on leprechauns. So you have to be very lucky, and you have to realize that she's looking for a book on leprechauns, because they don't always say that. And you have to have a really good book on leprechauns, because she's already rejected 50 over the past month, right?
Right.
So I have two questions now.
Okay.
What I run into as somebody who's helping writers in their first stages to avoid all of these pitfalls is that a lot of writers, and I was included in this, is you write something, you say, oh, it's great. What's the problem with writing a children's book? It's so easy. It's kids' work, really. You write something,
yep.
And you think the whole world is going to fall over, because you've written a story about the spaghetti you want it to be licorice, and you don't understand. And then you end up self-publishing and losing thousands and thousands of dollars. So run me through this and how we can avoid when people are so certain there's no craft involved.
Well, I mean, that's something that beginners do, because you just don't know. You haven't gone through the process. You don't know what the market's like and how people are going to react. And so what I always tell people is, when you're just getting started, it's really important to be getting feedback from other people, and not just from, your neighbor down the street, but from a critique group, which has the purpose of giving feedback, or from a trusted critique partner, or possibly from someone who has some kind of professional connection, like a librarian or a teacher.
I came to you after critique people
Right.
bullshitted me. You know, I believe in critique groups less than other people because
Well,
you're not going to write to somebody you don't know and say, oh, you know, this is really shitty.
so
Throw it
Matt,
off.
you know, let me just stop you a second, because I've heard this story from other people too, and that is true. There is a limit to what a critique group can do, and also different critique groups have different levels of ability and standards. So yes, you may find that your critique group is not being sufficiently harsh. You also may find your critique group is being overly harsh. You know, these things can happen, but the critique group, even with all its flaws, has been, and I've seen this happen for dozens of writers. A critique group is a really useful tool given, you know, given the reality of the publishing business and how it works. That it's kind of like the critique group is the way station between the individual writer and the business. It's not going to take you all the way there by itself, but a really good critique group, and I've seen this happen, a really good critique group can actually evolve. You know, critique groups can start out where everybody in the group is a beginner, but they stay together and they all learn and they raise each other up. And I know groups where, you know, 4 out of the original 6 members ended up getting published because over the course of years, they worked together and they learned. And of course, that doesn't always happen. In fact, it probably only happens a small percent of the time. But other times, you know, maybe one person in the group will really benefit from being in the group. Other times, the group will be together for 6 months, people will learn a little bit from it, and then it'll fall apart. And then you try another group. It's not a perfect system, but if you try to do it all on your own, I think you're going to have trouble. And then the only alternative is, you know, going to a conference once a year and getting a critique. And that's only going to take you so far.
Oh, but okay, but I found the perfect solution, and that's you.
Well, I'm not. Well, I'm actually going to disagree with you about that. I'm not the perfect solution for everybody.
Okay.
I was a perfect solution for you because of where you were. That you had been working on your own and with also help from various people for years and years, and you'd gotten to a certain point, and you hadn't been able to get beyond that. And yeah, I will work with people in that kind of situation, but most people who, you know, who are just getting started, it's going to take you a while before you're going to hit that plateau. And you want to get as far as you can on your own, partly because the learning process of working on manuscripts and revising them and learning your own processes, that's really valuable. And yeah, I'm happy to work with folks who need mentoring, but it's not something that everybody needs early on, and it's maybe not something that everybody needs at any point. Some people are lucky enough that, you know, because of their critique group or because of their writing partners, you know, I know a lot of people who, especially once they got to a certain point, they started working with a kind of a writing partner who was another writer writing the same kinds of material, and they would exchange manuscripts with each other and give each other feedback. And this would take them to a higher level, possibly, than working with a critique group.
Okay, and but I certainly think that you're wonderful.
But
And
thank you.
You've helped me a great deal. I gave you an impossible task, which was to take almost 20 stories and pick a small handful, and to do it kindly, which you did, because you know, a critique is a critique, and you have this way of choosing words so that the person is not terribly offended. So I think that my last question for today,
Okay.
before we start summing up, is what we talked about the eyeballs, but when you write a story for young children who can't read on their own,
Sure.
then it's a bunch of different eyeballs, isn't it?
That's right. That's right.
So
Yeah.
who are the eyeballs?
Well, yeah. So when you're writing for a picture book age audience, for kids who aren't reading yet, then it's not eyeballs that are taking in the story, it's ears. And though the eyeballs are also active when it comes to the visual part of the story. But in the picture book experience, there's also the adult or older child who is reading to the younger child. And they're experiencing the story too, and they are influencing the way that the listener is experiencing the story. So yes, that makes it a little more complicated, but it's still a reality that the young child who is the key audience for that story, they're having their reactions and responses as the story is being read to them.
Okay. Also, look, my favorite story was Madeline by Ludwig Bemelmans.
Oh, okay.
And
Yep.
my mom or dad chose that story. In other words, they're also the gatekeepers and the librarians and the grandparents.
Yep.
So you have lots of eyeballs when you're writing a book for young children.
That you definitely have to, I don't know necessarily keep it in mind, but it's definitely a reality that as a writer for children, though you're writing for children, and you should never forget that, your book has to go through multiple adult gatekeepers, starting with the gatekeepers at the publishing company.
Yeah, that's true.
And continuing out into the world through salespeople and booksellers and reviewers, and then the final purchaser or the person who picks it up off the shelf at the library. And by the time that's happened, it's gone through several adults probably. Yeah.
And so Harold, do you feel? I guess this is going to be my last question.
Okay.
Talk about the Beatles. You feel that there's a special legacy involved in working with children's books that other editors don't have?
What do you mean by a legacy?
Well, Madeline changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
The stories I read were read to me.
Mm-hmm.
These are life changers,
Sure.
And you've had I would say your finger, but your whole hand in dozens and dozens of books, helping dozens. You've helped hundreds of authors, maybe thousands.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a legacy here because these books go on to shape people's entire lives.
Sure. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about working in children's books, that any book that you work on could have that kind of life-changing impact or inspiration to the child who's reading it. And for many different possible reasons. It could be something as simple as seeing themselves in a book for the first time and realizing, oh, I can be in a story like this too. It could be getting excited about a particular field of information, like reading a book about the weather and thinking, oh, this is something you can actually understand and learn about. There's so many ways in which books have an impact. And I think all of us in the field, we all have that in the back of our minds. And we're always making sure that we're producing the best possible book and that it's going to have a positive impact. We may not, we try to avoid being didactic, but there's so many other ways that books have impact just beyond teaching something, that every book, even the simplest sweetest bedtime story has unpredictable impact. So you just try to do the best you can to make it be the best book it can be.
So Harold Underdown, I think that you are a remarkable human being. I still haven't figured out what makes you such a kind individual. Do you know why you're so kind?
I don't think I'm that kind, but I'm glad that you think that.
Okay, so that's 1 out of 2. And so before, I mean, there's a lot of things I don't know about you. I don't know how tall you are. How tall are you?
6 feet.
You're a tall guy. I'm going to have to look up to you when we meet in Brooklyn or Manhattan. We do have to meet, you know.
Some point, yeah. So Mel, now I want to ask you a question. I'm glad you mentioned Madeline, and I was going to ask you about your favorite childhood books. So after Madeline, which is a wonderful book, do you remember what was your first novel or chapter book that you read, or that you can remember?
The Hardy Boys.
Ah, okay. Mm-hmm.
I was a glutton for the Hardy Boys.
Okay, and that led to Sherlock Holmes.
I have no idea what led to Sherlock Holmes. And this interview is about you, Harold.
Okay.
So we didn't talk much about music, because usually when we're talking, you know, it's like very precious. Your time is precious, and I'm trying to figure out how to be a better author, and of course to find an agent, which is difficult anytime, and especially now. But I'm working on it, and you're helping me. But I think mainly to be a better writer. What you've taught me is that you have to keep your eye on the ball of the writing. Like everything else is important, but the writing is critical. If you don't have a good story, you can't have a good query. You can't have a good agent. Write a good story.
Yep.
So we didn't talk about music, and you're younger than I am, but what about the Beatles? Are you a Beatles fan?
Oh, yes. I mean, the Beatles were, when we were kids, the Beatles were a big, I don't know, just source of happiness. And I'm not sure how exactly that got started. I think it might have gotten started with the Yellow Submarine, which came out when I would have been, I think, 9 or 10. And it was a movie that my mom felt she could take all 3 of us to. I was the oldest of 3 brothers.
You went to see that movie?
We went to see it in the movie theater.
Everybody was smoking weed. Not
in this one. This was the family matinee. There was a movie theater. We lived in, this was when we were living in Providence in Rhode Island. And there was a movie theater across the river in Pawtucket that had a family matinee, and we would routinely go to this movie theater to see movies. And I remember we went to see the Yellow Submarine, and I think we all enjoyed it, including my youngest brother, who would have been, I think, 4 years old at the time. And I think we probably at that point acquired the soundtrack to the Yellow Submarine, and then we started buying other Beatles records. So the Beatles were probably the first pop group that I was into, and it was definitely but interestingly, it was a family thing. You know, all the members of the family, probably not my father so much, but all the members of the family enjoyed the Beatles.
And so I have to ask you what your favorite Beatles tune is.
My favorite Beatles tune?
I know it's difficult.
That's impossible. I mean, I really.
Okay, Harold, I'm going to give you a hint.
Answer that question.
Pick one that you can sing.
Well, I can't sing any of them, so that's easy.
Of course you can.
Nope.
What do you mean you can't?
I'm not a singer.
Everybody's a singer.
No. I'm an editor, not a singer.
I will teach you for free how to sing.
Okay,
Okay, so pick a song.
boy. Well, here's one of the ones that I like a lot. Maybe it's because of the publishing theme is Paperback Writer.
There you go. You're the second person on my show to pick that song.
Mhm.
And the other was probably one of my authors.
Uh-huh.
It's a song that speaks to people in the publishing profession.
Yep. Yep.
So it starts, "Dear Sir or Madam, will you read my book?"
Yep.
And I'm going to ask you now to sing it.
And I'm not going to do that. And I will point out though that it's kind of a funny song because it exhibits quite a few fundamental errors in going about making a submission to a publishing company, which is one of the things that I think is funniest about it.
So yeah, we should do a shtick sometime on that.
I don't do shtick, Mel. You can do shtick.
Why say never, Harold? We're young.
That's true. I don't do shtick yet. There, see, that's positive mindset. I don't do shtick yet.
Exactly. Now that you've got Mel, you know, the sky's the limit. Harold Underdown, what haven't I asked you? I should have asked you.
What haven't you asked me that you should have asked me? I don't know. I think you've pretty much covered it. You know, you got my whole publishing focus right out there, and my childhood. I don't know.
I didn't get your angst.
I know what you haven't asked me. You haven't asked me what I'm reading.
Okay. What are you reading, Harold?
Well, I'm rereading because I'm finding it very hard to focus on new stuff these days, surprisingly. I'm rereading Leigh Bardugo's Grisha trilogy, and I'm on the third book, which is called Ruin and Rising. And this is a YA fantasy trilogy with a really wonderful magic setup and an interesting cultural setting. The main society that is the focus of these stories, though there are other societies on the world that she imagines. The main society is kind of loosely based on 19th century Russia. So it's this 19th century Russia where people can do interesting kinds of personal magic. It's sort of a quality that you have in you and that you can train. Some people can create winds. Some people can move water. They're called tide makers, and they can move water in different ways. Some people can affect other people's bodies. They can stop your heart, or they can heal you. It's great, and it's a really great good and evil story, big story with people you care about right in the middle of it. So I recommend it.
Okay, Harold Underdown, I recommend you.
Thank you.
Any writers of children's literature? He's one of the remarkable people in the world to turn to for help. How was that for a promo?
That was a great promo, Mel. Thank you. And you're very good at doing this. I want to thank you for being a good interviewer.
Well, thank you very much. But you know, it's all about you, Harold. So thanks very much. I don't want to let you go, but I have to. And we'll talk later. We have mountains to climb.
We do. Thanks for having me, Mel. It's been fun.
Thanks so much, Harold Underdown. You've got Mel always.
Take care.